March 6, 1945. Cologne, Germany. The city lies in ruins. Smoke curls through the hollowed streets. Once grand buildings are now broken silhouettes. Stone, glass, and silence. The war has consumed everything here. From the distance, a low growl echoes. The sound of steel on shattered cobblestones. A lone American tank, the new M26 Pershing, inches forward through the debris. Its olive hull glistens under a pale, ash-colored sky. Inside, 5 men sit in tense quiet, their breath shallow, their ears tuned to the distant hum of engines that aren't theirs. At the gunner's seat, Clarence Smoyer, a Pennsylvania steelworker turned tank gunner, presses his eye to the sight. Sweat trickles down his temple. Every second stretches thin. The smell of oil and cordite hangs heavy. Then, movement. Across the intersection, through a veil of dust, a dark shape emerges. A German Panzer T4 angled toward them. Radio static fills the cabin. The commander's voice uncertain, waiting for orders. But Smoyer doesn't wait. His finger tightens. A blinding flash fills the cathedral square. History holds its breath. Because in this single moment, one gunner's unauthorized shot would mark the end of Cologne's last stand. By early 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final act, but it was far from over. The Allies had broken through the Siegfried Line, crossed into western Germany, and were closing in on the Rhine. Yet every street, every hill, and every bridge was contested with the desperation of a dying empire. For the men of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, the road east had been long and merciless. They had fought from the hedgerows of Normandy through the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Now their next target stood before them. Cologne, one of Germany's largest cities and a vital industrial hub on the western bank of the Rhine River. Capturing, it would open the path to the heart of the Reich, to the bridges that led toward Berlin. The Germans knew this. They turned the once vibrant city into a fortress. Rubble piles became barricades, cellars became firing points. Panzer divisions, though depleted, waited like cornered predators amid the ruins. In February 1945, as American infantry divisions closed in, the 3rd Armored Division received a new weapon, one that many tankers had prayed for since the first encounters with German Tigers in Normandy. It was called the M26 Pershing, heavier, slower, and far more powerful than the Sherman. The Pershing carried a 90mm gun capable of piercing the armor of a Tiger I. For the first time, U.S. crews had a machine that could face German armor on equal terms. But it arrived late, too late for most of the campaign, and too few in number to turn the tide alone. Only 20 were shipped to Europe by early 1945. Among the men assigned to test it in combat was Clarence Smoyer, part of the 32nd Armored Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed Spearhead. Smoyer wasn't a career soldier. Before the war, he had been a quiet man working at a Pennsylvania steel mill. He joined the Army in 1942 and trained as a tank gunner. In the early days, his weapon was the M4 Sherman, fast but tragically undergunned. He had watched fellow crews destroyed by German Tigers that could knock them out from over a mile away. Each engagement was a gamble, speed and numbers against German precision and firepower. By the time the Pershing arrived, Smoyer was a veteran, calm under pressure, methodical in movement, and known among his crew for his steady hands and steel nerves. His commander, Lieutenant William Reese, trusted him completely. Their crew had survived battles across France and Belgium. Now they would be among the first Americans to take this new tank into combat. In late February, they received their orders. The Spearhead Division was to move into Cologne, capture the city, and secure its vital bridge over the Rhine, if it still stood. The operation was dangerous. The Luftwaffe still harassed advancing columns, and every street hid the threat of Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank guns. But morale was high. Everyone could feel that the end of the war was near. The Pershing was nicknamed Fireball, a symbol of its power and promise. The crew knew they were carrying America's technological answer to the Tiger, and they were eager to prove it. On March 5, 1945, the 3rd Armored's Combat Command B pushed into the outskirts of Cologne. The city was a graveyard of buildings and smoke. The air reeked of burned stone and cordite. Resistance was sporadic but fierce. German soldiers, many of them barely trained youths and old men, fought block by block, refusing to surrender. As the Americans advanced toward the Cathedral Square, Command ordered all tank crews to proceed cautiously. Every corner could conceal a hidden gun. The priority was to minimize losses, not to take reckless risks. But amid the caution, tension grew. Radio confusion, conflicting orders, and the chaos of urban combat blurred the lines between what was commanded and what was necessary. Inside the Pershing, Clarence Smoyer listened to the orders. Move slowly. Wait for infantry. Avoid unnecessary engagements. Yet deep down, he knew. In Cologne, hesitation could kill. And somewhere ahead, unseen through the smoke, another tank crew was waiting, aiming, and thinking the same thing. The roads narrowed, the ruins closed in, and the heart of Cologne loomed ahead. The men of Fireball could feel that the city's end, and their test, was near. By dawn on March 6, 1945, Cologne was a city trapped between two worlds, the dying Third Reich and the approaching liberation. The cathedral still stood, blackened and scarred but defiant, rising above the sea of rubble. Around it, the streets were empty except for the rumble of engines and the distant crack of rifle fire. The U.S. 3rd Armored Division's advance was coordinated yet cautious. In dense urban terrain, tanks were blind giants. Every alley could conceal a Panzerfaust, every corner a 88mm gun waiting in ambush. Infantry moved ahead in short bursts, clearing buildings one at a time. Tanks followed slowly, covering their advance. Urban warfare was not what American tankers were trained for. The doctrine that had carried them through the open fields of France and Belgium, fast flanking, long-range engagements, no longer applied. Now, steel met stone, and visibility was measured in meters, not miles. Communication broke down as buildings blocked radio signals. Commanders issued general instructions. But once inside the city, crews were largely on their own. Among them was Lieutenant Reese's crew, the men of the new M26 Pershing. They had orders to push toward the Cathedral District to support infantry clearing operations. Smoyer, manning the 90mm gun, knew the risk. The narrow streets made their tank an easy target, and the Germans defending Cologne were among the last determined holdouts west of the Rhine, across the city. Remnants of German forces, a mix of Wehrmacht regulars, Volkssturm militia, and SS units, had orders from Berlin: hold Cologne at all costs. The Rhine was Hitler's last natural barrier before the Allies reached the industrial heartland of Germany. Losing Cologne meant opening the road to Düsseldorf and the Ruhr. German commanders placed Panzerviehs and Panthers strategically within the ruins to ambush advancing Allied armor. Many of these tanks had little fuel or ammunition left, but their gunners were experienced and deadly. One such tank, a Panzer IV Ausf H, lay concealed near the Cathedral Square, positioned behind a collapsed building with its gun aimed down the main boulevard. It was one of the last armored vehicles defending the city. Its crew, likely veterans of the Eastern or Western Front, waited silently amid the debris, hoping to catch an American tank crossing their line of fire. The Pershing crew's orders that morning were clear: advance carefully. Avoid confrontation unless necessary. Maintain radio contact with infantry, but clear meant little in the chaos of Cologne. The Pershing advanced past burned-out Shermans, through intersections lined with shattered trams and the twisted skeletons of buildings. The distant echo of artillery rolled like thunder. Smoyer's commander, Lieutenant Reese, peered through the periscope. "Keep eyes open," he said quietly. The words needed no response. Every man in that tank was already at full alert. Then the radio crackled. Reports of a German tank sighted near the cathedral. The Pershing slowed to a crawl. Smoyer's heart began to race, but his movements stayed precise, deliberate. He adjusted the sight, scanning the rubble ahead for movement or metallic glint. At that moment, orders came from Division HQ: hold position. Do not engage until infantry confirm target identity. It was standard protocol. Urban warfare was chaotic. Friendly fire was a constant risk. But in the smoky ruins of Cologne, waiting could be fatal. The Pershing rolled forward a few more feet, into the open stretch leading toward the cathedral square. The gun turret rotated, sweeping left and right. Nothing moved. The square appeared empty, until a faint flicker of light flashed from across the street. Smoyer froze. It was the glint of sunlight on steel. A tank barrel. The Panzer IV had them in its sights. Inside the Pershing, seconds felt like hours. Smoyer tracked the source of the reflection through the gun sight. He could see the faint outline of the German turret, half hidden behind a collapsed wall. He knew what the rulebook said. Wait for confirmation. Report position. Await command. But he also knew that by the time confirmation came, the Panzer would have fired first. This was the moment that separated soldiers who followed orders from those who survived them. Smoyer steadied his breathing. His hands hovered over the firing controls. He didn't speak. Not yet. Lieutenant Reese was still scanning the horizon when Smoyer whispered the words that would echo through history. Tank, 11 o'clock. The commander turned, saw the shadow, and realized it too late. The Panzer's gun began to elevate. Smoyer's mind made the calculation before his commander gave the word. He would fire. Authorized or not, it was their only chance. And in that instant, discipline and instinct collided. A decision that would define the legend of Clarence Smoyer. The moment was set. 2 tanks, 2 crews, 1 street of broken stone between them. The next move would decide who lived. Clarence Smoyer was not the image of a hardened killer. He was quiet, soft-spoken, the kind of man who fixed machines before the war and preferred silence to speeches. But inside the turret of a tank, something in him shifted. Not rage, not aggression, but precision. Smoyer's composure under pressure was legendary within his regiment. Fellow tankers said he never shouted, never panicked, and never missed. He had spent years learning how to align crosshairs, how to breathe between heartbeats, how to read the movement of light through a gunner's scope. In Cologne, those habits became the difference between life and death. The decision he made that morning, to fire before command approval, wasn't reckless. It was instinct honed by experience. Smoyer had seen too many Shermans burn to the ground because they waited. Each time a gunner hesitated, another crew died. He wasn't about to let that happen again. Inside the cramped turret, his world shrank to one thing: the image through the sight. The German tank's barrel, aimed straight toward them. The crack in the brick wall beside it. The faint shimmer of exhaust. In that fraction of a second, training and morality vanished. There was only survival and duty. To Smoyer, the unauthorized shot wasn't defiance. It was necessity. The duel that unfolded in Cologne wasn't just a clash between 2 tanks. It was a technological showdown between the old and the new. The German Panzer IV, once the backbone of the Wehrmacht's armored forces, was nearing obsolescence by 1945. It was tough, reliable but outmatched by the heavy guns of late-war Allied tanks. Armed with a 75mm KWK-40L-48 gun, it could still destroy a Sherman, but it was no longer dominant. The American M26 Pershing, on the other hand, was a leap forward. Its 90mm M3 gun could punch through 100 millimeters of armor at over 1,000 meters, more than enough to kill a Panzer IV head-on. It had a stabilizer that allowed more accurate fire on the move, a thicker armor hull, and a powerful Ford GAF engine that gave it surprising mobility for its weight. Yet, on paper, numbers meant little in the narrow streets of Cologne. Visibility was the true weapon. Whichever gunner spotted and fired first usually won. The Pershing's advantage lay not only in its weaponry, but in its optics. American crews had begun fitting tanks with improved M71D telescopic sights, giving Smoyer a clear, steady view of targets across rubble-strewn streets. The Germans, though experienced, often fought with damaged or improvised equipment by this stage of the war. Still, it was never certain. A Panzer's first shot, if it hit, could easily set a tank ablaze. One shell through the turret or engine compartment, and 5 men could be reduced to ashes in seconds. So when Smoyer looked through the Pershing's sight that morning, he was facing not just a tank, but the legacy of German engineering that had dominated the battlefield since 1939. And with one pull of the trigger, he would prove that America's long-awaited answer had finally arrived. Tank warfare was a choreography of men and machines, 5 soldiers bound by discipline, coordination, and trust. Inside the Pershing, space was a luxury they didn't have. Every movement was practiced, every command repeated in calm precision. At the top sat Lieutenant Reese, the tank commander, his head just above the open hatch, scanning for threats. To his right, Clarence Smoyer, the gunner, sat hunched over the turret controls. Behind him, the loader waited, his hand resting on the next 90mm shell, ready to ram it into the breach. Below, the driver and bow gunner handled the motion and defense of the vehicle. When the order to fire came, it wasn't chaos. It was a well-drilled sequence that lasted mere seconds. But in Cologne, that order didn't come. Smoyer made the decision on instinct. He knew the rhythm of battle, knew when to wait, and when to act. From the corner of his eye, he saw the German gun elevate. That subtle movement that every tanker feared. It meant the enemy had a bead on them. Inside the turret, no one shouted. Reese didn't have time to issue a command. The loader already sensed what was coming and had the round in place. The driver stopped the tank for a clear shot. Smoyer's finger rested lightly on the trigger. His mind was silent. He fired. The recoil slammed through the tank, the blast echoing down the stone canyon of the street. The 90mm shell streaked toward its target, trailing a ribbon of smoke. For the first time in the war, the Pershing had drawn blood in a tank duel, and the American gunner who pulled the trigger had done it against orders. That single shot wasn't just tactical. It was symbolic. It represented the moment when American armor finally stood equal against the machines that had terrorized Europe for years. And as the smoke cleared, the line between discipline and survival began to blur even more sharply. For the German tank crew hidden near the Cologne Cathedral, the day began in grim silence. They were part of what remained of the Panzer Brigade 106, a shattered formation pieced together from veterans and young recruits. Fuel was scarce, ammunition scarcer, but orders were absolute. Hold the city, delay the Americans, buy time for the defense of the Rhine. The Panzer IV Ausfuhr H, they commanded, was a veteran machine itself. Its paint was burned, its sides scarred by shrapnel from years of combat. Its 75mm gun could still destroy an Allied tank, but only if it struck first. Inside the cramped hull, 4 men waited. The commander peered through a cracked periscope. The gunner kept his hand on the elevation wheel. The loader wiped his palms on his soot-stained uniform. Their breath fogged in the cold. They could hear the distant rumble of American tanks, the rhythmic growl of engines echoing down the boulevards. The streets were empty. save for drifting smoke and the faint flutter of torn propaganda posters clinging to the walls. When they saw the M26 Pershing roll into view, it must have felt both familiar and terrifying. The Germans had faced hundreds of Shermans. They knew their weaknesses. But this one looked different. Larger, lower, more menacing. They didn't know yet that this was America's new heavy tank. They turned the turret slowly, lining up the gun. The commander whispered an order. The loader rammed in a shell. But before they could fire, the Pershing's muzzle flashed white. The 90mm round struck with brutal precision. The Panzer IV erupted, its turret engulfed in flame. Within seconds, the German crew was lost, their final defense extinguished in a single strike. That duel, captured by a U.S. Signal Corps cameraman from a nearby building, would become one of the most iconic pieces of tank combat footage in history, showing, in real time, the end of German armored dominance. In the doctrine of armored warfare, command structure was sacred. Orders flowed down and execution flowed up. Every tank was a cog in a vast moving formation. But by 1945, the front lines of Europe had turned doctrine into chaos. Radios failed, commanders were killed or out of position. Split-second decisions made by sergeants or corporals often determined the survival of entire units. Inside Cologne, orders were simple. Avoid unnecessary confrontation. Await coordination with infantry. The U.S. Army wanted to minimize casualties. Every destroyed tank was another logistical burden. Yet on the ground, where seconds meant survival, those rules felt distant. When Smoyer saw the Panzer aiming toward them, he knew what waiting meant. It meant dying with orders still echoing in the radio. The decision he made was one that thousands of soldiers before him had made in different forms, to act first and justify later. His commander, Lieutenant Reese, never reprimanded him. There was no need. Every man in that tank understood what had just happened, an act of initiative that had saved them all. After the battle, when the footage was reviewed, senior officers would later note that Smoyer's shot represented an example of decisive battlefield judgment. What was once unauthorized quickly became celebrated. It was a moment where instinct became doctrine, where human judgment, under fire, triumphed over rigid command. To the outside world, the duel in Cologne looked like heroism, a clean, decisive victory caught on film. But for the men inside the Pershing, it was far more complex. When the German tank burst into flames, Smoyer didn't cheer. None of them did. Inside the turret, the smell of gunpowder mixed with the sharp tang of burning metal. Through the gun sight, Smoyer could see the Panzer's hatch opening, smoke pouring out. One figure tried to escape. He collapsed before reaching the street. The loader looked away. The driver muttered something under his breath, and in that instant, the silence inside the tank was heavier than any explosion. Smoyer later said he never felt triumph in that moment, only relief that his crew had survived. The footage, played for years in newsreels and documentaries, captured the fire, the destruction, the victory, but not the weight carried by the man who pulled the trigger. It was the paradox of the gunner's life. Victory meant death. Skill meant killing faster than the other man could. And though the world would later hail him as the hero of Cologne, Smoyer himself remained humble, almost reluctant, when recalling the duel. He had done his job. Nothing more. Nothing less. The clash in Cologne wasn't just a story of metal and fire. It was a study in human instinct, leadership, and the thin moral line that war erases. And for Clarence Smoyer, that line would define his life long after the guns fell silent. The smoke was still settling when Lieutenant Reese's crew realized what had happened. They had just ended one of the last tank duels on the Western Front, and the cameras had captured it all. That footage would soon travel across the Atlantic, turning one quiet gunner's decision into legend. The morning of March 6, 1945, had broken gray and still. Cologne, once a city of nearly 800,000, was now a labyrinth of rubble and shadows. Fires burned in hollow windows. The cathedral stood like a blackened sentinel, its twin spires piercing the smoke. The M26 Pershing, call sign Fireball, rolled carefully along Komödienstrasse, its treads grinding glass and broken stone into dust. Each corner could hide death. The air was thick with the smell of damp ash, fuel, and cordite. Inside the tank, 5 men shared that breathless tension. Lieutenant William Reese, the commander, crouched under the open hatch, binoculars raised. He scanned every ruin for movement. Below him, Clarence Smoyer sat at his gunner's scope, one hand on the elevation wheel, the other hovering near the trigger. To his left, the loader, John DeRiggy, cradled a 90mm shell, muscles tight with anticipation. Driver Bob Early and bow gunner Homer Davis waited below, feeling each tremor through the steel floor. Through the cracked remnants of the city center, they moved toward the cathedral square, unaware that another predator waited ahead. The German Panzer IV was already in position. It sat angled behind the ruins of a hotel, its camouflage mottled with dust and soot. Its commander, a veteran sergeant, watched the empty street through the narrow periscope slit. He had been waiting for hours, knowing the Americans were coming. When the Pershing's silhouette appeared through the smoke, the German's heartbeat quickened. He barked an order. The gunner began to rotate the turret, but the Pershing crew saw it too, a dark barrel shifting through the haze. Smoyer's voice broke the silence inside the tank. Enemy tank. 11 o'clock, Reese turned. The shape was unmistakable. A Panzer IV, less than 200 meters away. He hesitated for a split second. Protocol demanded confirmation. But Smoyer didn't wait. He had made this calculation countless times in his head. Distance, angle, barrel position, wind. Now, he didn't think. He simply acted. His hand slammed the power traverse. The Pershing's turret swung with a hydraulic hum, centering the crosshairs over the German tank. Up! The loader shouted. The shell was chambered. Smoyer exhaled slowly, aligning the sight just below the enemy's turret ring. He squeezed the trigger. The world erupted. The 90mm M82 APC shell shot across the square in a blur, striking the Panzer's frontal armor. The explosion punched through the steel like paper. Flames burst from the turret. The German tank shuddered, then stopped moving. Inside the Pershing, no one spoke. They waited. Through the scope, Smoyer could see the German loader trying to open the hatch. Fire engulfed him. The tank's turret glowed orange from the heat. Smoyer fired again. The second shell hit the base of the turret, sending fragments through the hull. Smoke billowed upward, black and dense. Within seconds, the Panzer was finished. From a nearby building, U.S. Signal Corps cameraman Jim Bates had been filming the Pershing's advance. His 16mm camera caught the entire exchange, from the Pershing's first shot to the burning wreck of the Panzer. It would later become one of the most famous pieces of tank combat footage ever recorded. The Pershing's crew didn't know it at the time. They only knew the city had gone eerily quiet. The German tank's explosion echoed through the cathedral square and faded into the wind. Then came the smell. Burning fuel and scorched paint. A heavy silence settled over the street. "Target destroyed," Smoyer said quietly. Reese nodded. "Good work. Let's move." They didn't linger. The battle wasn't over. The Pershing advanced past the wreckage, the camera still rolling above them. In that single exchange, barely 30 seconds, something changed. For years, German armor had dominated Europe's battlefields. The Tiger and Panther were names whispered with dread among Allied tank crews. American Shermans had faced them with courage, but not equality. That changed in Cologne. The duel proved the Pershing's power, not on paper, but in the crucible of combat. For the first time, an American tank had outgunned a German Panzer in open confrontation, and won. And the man behind that victory wasn't a general or a designer. It was a quiet gunner from Pennsylvania who chose to act when hesitation meant death. In the command logs, the event was written simply, "Enemy tank destroyed. 1 Panzer IV. Engagement duration under 1 minute." But for those who witnessed it, and for the millions who would later watch the footage, it was more than a tactical note. It was a symbol that Germany's once invincible armor could be beaten, a symbol that instinct, courage, and timing could rewrite the rules of war. As the Pershing disappeared into the smoke, the burning Panzer still glowed near the cathedral, a pyre marking the end of an era. But the day was far from over. Beyond the square, German resistance still clung to life. Snipers, machine guns, and barricades waited deeper inside the city. And for Clarence Smoyer, the battle was not yet finished, because soon another target would emerge. One that would test not his aim, but his restraint. The Pershing crept deeper into the ruins of Cologne. Smoke curled through the shattered avenues. The cathedral loomed to their right, its Gothic towers scarred but unbroken. Smoyer peered through the gun sight, scanning the streets ahead. Every shadow could hide a muzzle. Every silent window might flash with gunfire. They had destroyed a Panzer IV, but the city wasn't theirs yet. German infantry still held pockets of resistance. Snipers fired from upper floors, then vanished before the Americans could respond. Every block was a trap. The tank's radio crackled. "Fireball. Proceed with caution. Resistance ahead near the Rhine Bridge." Reese acknowledged. "Copy that." He glanced down at Smoyer, eyes sharp. "We're not done." The Pershing rumbled forward. The driver's hands trembled slightly on the controls, not from fear, but fatigue. They'd been fighting for days with little rest, pushing through one German town after another. Smoyer's heart still thudded from the last engagement. The Panzer kill had been quick, clean. But war was never just about the next shot. It was about what came after. The faces you didn't see, the buildings left burning. He adjusted the periscope. The crosshairs swept across a pile of rubble, then stopped. Something moved. Down the street, a German armored car, possibly a Stukovsky 234-2 Puma, sat angled behind debris. Its turret was motionless, its crew unaware of the Pershing's presence. Smoyer's training kicked in. He tracked the gun's movement, aligning the reticle over the armored car's side. "Target, armored vehicle. Range 150, he reported. "Take it," Reese replied. Smoyer fired. The 90mm shell struck the target dead center. The explosion ripped through the thin armor, igniting ammunition. Flames burst through the hatches. The crew didn't stand a chance. A second enemy vehicle destroyed within minutes. But as the smoke cleared, something unexpected appeared in the edge of the scope. A civilian, a young woman in a long coat, stumbled into the open street, terrified, disoriented. She ran from a doorway near the burning wreck. The loader swore. "Jesus, she's right there." Smoyer froze, fingers still on the trigger, his scope centered on the woman. Through the glass, he could see her shielding her face from the heat, trying to cross the street. Reese yelled from above, "Hold fire! Civilians in the area!" The tank crew sat in tense silence as the woman disappeared into the smoke. That brief moment, a single civilian caught between two infernos, hit Smoyer harder than the gunfire. He'd been fighting for months, but this was different. In that flash of humanity, he remembered what the war was costing, not just in soldiers, but in lives. Minutes later, a new sound echoed, the crack of an anti-tank gun. A shell slammed into the corner of a building beside them, showering the Pershing with brick dust. Another followed, closer. Contact. 9 o'clock! Reese shouted. Smoyer swung the turret. He saw the source. A POC-40 anti-tank gun positioned in the shadow of a railway arch. German gunners were reloading. Range 200. Up! Shouted de Riggy, jamming another shell into the breach. Smoyer fired before the Germans could. The 90mm shell tore through the archway, detonating against the gun's shield. The explosion sent debris flying. The enemy crew vanished in a cloud of fire and dust. When the blast cleared, the crew sat in stunned silence. 3 engagements. 3 victories. But this wasn't a triumph they could celebrate. Outside, Cologne lay in ruin. Smoyer could see smoke rising from the bridge district, the sound of small arms echoing from the Rhine. The Pershing idled near the cathedral. Soldiers from the 3rd Armored Division advanced on foot beside them, rifles raised, eyes darting between doorways. The cameraman, Jim Bates, moved alongside the tank, still filming. He captured everything: the Pershing's movements, the gunfire, the burning wrecks. His footage would later become legendary, but for the men in the frame, it was simply survival. By afternoon, the city center was secured. The Pershing crew halted near the railway station, engines rumbling low. Inside the tank, the air was hot and heavy. Sweat, smoke, and oil mixed into a metallic haze. Smoyer sat with his head against the sight, breathing hard. He wasn't thinking about medals or glory. He was thinking about the woman who'd crossed the street, and how close she'd come to dying. Reese broke the silence. Good work, boys. You did it right today. Smoyer didn't answer. He looked out through the scope one last time. The square, the burning tanks, the cathedral beyond. In that moment, he understood something most never would. Victory didn't feel like pride. It felt like exhaustion. Later, when the footage reached Allied command, it was hailed as proof of the Pershing's superiority and of the courage of its crew. The images of the burning Panzer and the advancing Pershing spread across the world. But for Clarence Smoyer, the man behind the gun, the real turning point wasn't the shot that destroyed the German tank. It was the moment he chose not to fire. That restraint, amid the chaos of war, revealed a different kind of courage, one not written in after-action reports, but carried quietly in the conscience of a soldier who'd seen enough of death. The battle for Cologne marked the end of German armor dominance and the dawn of American steel supremacy. The Pershing had proven itself, and the tide of war was irreversible. Yet, amid victory, the human cost remained. And for Smoyer, that memory would linger for decades, from the gunner's seat of Fireball he had watched the world burn and learned the price of being the man who pulled the trigger. The battle for Cologne ended within days, but its echoes rolled far beyond the city's ruins. When the smoke cleared, what had once been one of Germany's largest urban centers was now a skeletal landscape of stone and ash. The 9th Armored Division and 3rd Armored Division had breached the city from the west, closing in toward the Rhine. Resistance crumbled, but not without cost. Snipers, mines, and last-ditch Panzerfaust ambushes claimed dozens of American lives even after the Panzer's destruction. For the men of Fireball, the Pershing tank that had faced the German armor head-on, the aftermath was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Their radios, once alive with orders and panic, now crackled with static and scattered chatter. When they finally halted near the Cologne Cathedral, soldiers from nearby units gathered around the wreck of the Panzer IV. The German tank still smoked, its steel carcass twisted from the 90mm impact. The blackened spires of the cathedral towered over it, two symbols of survival amid destruction. A few yards away, Army cameraman Jim Bates stood beside his 16mm Bell & Howell, winding the film back into its reel. He had captured everything: The Pershing's approach, the duel, the explosion. He didn't know it yet, but his footage would become one of the most iconic combat films of World War II. A rare, clear record of tank warfare in an urban battlefield. The Pershing crew didn't feel like heroes. They were too tired for that. Inside the tank, Clarence Smoyer wiped the soot from his hands and stared at the gun's breech. He'd fired 3 rounds in combat that day, 2 at a tank, 1 at an armored car. Every shot had hit its mark. But it wasn't the accuracy he remembered. It was the moment he didn't fire, when a single civilian had wandered into his crosshairs. That image, fragile, human, terrified, lingered longer than any explosion. For weeks after the battle, Smoyer replayed it in his mind. The tank's power, the instant destruction, the ease of it all. It was a paradox that haunted many tankers. They could obliterate an enemy vehicle in seconds, yet feel utterly powerless to protect the people around them. Military command, however, saw only results. The M26 Pershing had performed beyond expectation. Its 90mm gun had penetrated the Panzer's armor at range, a feat the Sherman's 75mm could rarely achieve. Reports flowed up the chain of command, praising its stability, firepower, and crew effectiveness. In the after-action summary, the Pershing's performance was listed as exemplary under combat conditions. It became the foundation for future U.S. tank doctrine. Within months, Pershings would appear across Europe, reinforcing the armored spearhead into the heart of Germany. For American troops, the duel in Cologne was proof that the armor balance had shifted. The myth of German invincibility, born from years of Tiger and Panther dominance, began to crumble. The U.S. finally had a tank that could meet the enemy head-on and win. Still, the victory came too late to change the overall shape of the war. By March 1945, Germany was already collapsing. The Allies were closing from the west, the Soviets from the east. Cologne was one of the last major cities before the Rhine, a gateway to the final push. For Smoyer and his crew, it marked the end of one fight and the beginning of another. After Cologne, they crossed the river, advancing through shattered towns and surrendered outposts until Germany itself finally broke apart. But long after the shooting stopped, the footage from Cologne lived on. It circulated through newsreels and propaganda reels, shown to soldiers and civilians alike. For many Americans back home, it was their first clear glimpse of how brutal and personal tank combat could be. The clip of the burning Panzer, the Pershing gliding past, and the cathedral looming behind them became a defining image of the war's final months. And behind that image stood Clarence Smoyer, a man who had followed orders, acted on instinct, and yet never forgot the weight of a single decision. As Cologne fell silent, Smoyer and his crew parked Fireball near the edge of the cathedral square. The air was still thick with ash. Somewhere beyond the smoke, church bells rang faintly, the first in months. It was over, for now. But the war had left its mark on them, and on the steel beast that carried them through it. In the weeks following Cologne's fall, the Allied front surged forward like an unstoppable tide. American armored divisions crossed the Rhine River, breached the Siegfried Line, and pressed into the heart of Western Germany. The end of the war was now measured not in months, but in weeks. For Clarence Smoyer and the crew of the Pershing Fireball, the advance was relentless but strangely hollow. The duel at Cologne had made them famous, yet they never sought attention. The footage that immortalized them, the burning Panzer, the Black Cathedral, the thunder of the 90mm gun, became a symbol of American power. But for the men inside the tank, it was simply a memory of smoke, sound, and fear. When the film reached Allied headquarters in Paris, it spread rapidly through U.S. Army Signal Corps channels. Military analysts dissected every frame. They studied Smoyer's firing sequence, the Pershing's maneuvering speed, and the Panzer's reaction. The conclusion was clear. The M26 Pershing had proven its worth. Its armor could withstand German high-velocity rounds. Its firepower outclassed any Panzer still operating on the Western Front. And its crew, ordinary soldiers from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Ohio, had shown what well-trained Americans could do when given the right tools. It was more than a tactical success. It was psychological. For years, Allied tank crews had whispered about the terrifying silhouette of the Tiger and Panther. At last, those fears had been reversed. Now, German soldiers learned to dread the Pershing's arrival. The low rumble, the long barrel, the white star painted on its hull. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. Europe's cities were liberated, but they were also ruined. Smoyer and his crew survived the war, but Fireball did not. Their tank was hit during later operations, possibly by a Panzerfaust ambush while crossing the Rhine. It was disabled and left behind. Another casualty of a war that consumed both men and machines. Still, the story of the Cologne duel endured. In post-war reports, the engagement was highlighted as one of the first recorded victories of the Pershing against a German tank. It demonstrated how decisive crew discipline and gunnery skill could be under extreme pressure. But for Smoyer, heroism wasn't what he remembered. Years later, he would say, "You're not thinking about medals. You're thinking about staying alive." He carried that humility all his life. After the war, Smoyer returned to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where he worked as a store clerk and later as a machinist. He rarely spoke about what happened in Cologne. When people mentioned the famous footage, he nodded quietly, offering few words. It wasn't until decades later, when historians tracked down the Pershing crew, that his story resurfaced. In interviews, Smoyer described the moment through the gunner's sight. The movement, the aim, the flash. But it was the image of the civilian woman crossing the street that stayed with him the most. That haunting glimpse of innocence amid fire and ruin reminded him of why restraint mattered, even in total war. The Cologne duel. Footage is still studied in military academies today. It remains one of the clearest examples of tank versus tank combat ever filmed. The 30-second exchange encapsulated years of armored warfare evolution, from doctrine to technology, from courage to chance. In that single instant, Clarence Smoyer embodied both the precision of a soldier and the conscience of a man who understood what his weapon could do. The ruins of Cologne have long been rebuilt. The cathedral stands restored, its spires reaching once again into a peaceful sky. But beneath its foundation lies the memory of that burning square, where steel clashed and history turned. Smoyer lived to see that peace. In 2019, more than 70 years after the battle, he returned to Cologne. The city that once burned under his guns now welcomed him as a guest of honor. Standing near the same spot where he had fought, he met the German civilians who had survived that day, including the woman who had crossed the street all those years before. They embraced, tears replacing the smoke and fear that once filled that square. For Smoyer, it was closure. For history, it was full circle. As he left Cologne for the final time, Smoyer looked once more at the cathedral, the same structure that had stood tall amid ruin. Time had erased the scars from the city's walls, but not from the hearts of those who had seen them. The gunner from Allentown, who once helped destroy a Panzer under that shadow, now stood as a symbol of reconciliation. The war had ended long ago, but its lessons, courage, restraint, and humanity remained. The duel in Cologne was more than a victory. It was a mirror held up to the entire Second World War. It revealed the dual nature of modern warfare, the triumph of technology, and the tragedy of those forced to wield It Clarence Smoyer's 90mm gun ended one of Germany's last armored threats in the West. His calm precision and instinctive action symbolized the industrial strength and tactical evolution that defined the Allied victory. The M26 Pershing, born from years of sacrifice and frustration, had finally proven that American armor could stand equal to and surpass its German counterpart. Yet amid that triumph, Smoyer's story reminds us that courage is not only found in the trigger pulled, but also in the one withheld. In the chaos of battle, surrounded by fire and ruin, he chose restraint when a civilian crossed his sights. It was a fleeting decision, but one that carried far greater weight than any shell fired that day. It was a reminder that even in total war, amid cities reduced to dust, amid orders and obedience, humanity still flickered inside the machine. That is why his story endures. Not because of the number of tanks destroyed, but because of what it revealed about those who fought inside them. The footage of the duel has been shown for decades, in classrooms, documentaries, and museums. It freezes a single instant of clarity within the blur of history. 2 machines, 2 crews, 1 survivor. Behind that steel and smoke was a 21-year-old gunner who carried the weight of both life and death in his hands, and who, long after the war, carried its memory in silence. When Smoyer stood once more in Cologne in his final years, he didn't see victory. He saw peace, fragile, hard-won, and sacred. The same cathedral that towered over the wrecks in 1945 now rang with bells of reconciliation. History had come full circle, and in that quiet moment, the gunner who once fought under its shadow finally laid down the burden of his aim. Because in the end, the greatest act of a soldier is not to destroy, but to remember.